The morning mist clung to the Cascade Mountains like a shroud as Sarah Chen wiped down the counter of her family's hardware store, the same routine she'd followed for 8 years since returning to Millbrook, Oregon. At 34, she had perfected the art of invisibility in plain sight, her petite frame often overlooked among the towering shelves of nuts, bolts, and hunting supplies that filled Chun's hardware and supply. The faded flannel shirt, paint-stained jeans, and work boots she wore daily had become her uniform of anonymity, a carefully constructed image that kept curious questions at bay. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. But on this particular October morning, as the bell above her door chimed with the arrival of 6 Marines from nearby Camp Cascade, Sarah had no idea that her carefully guarded secret was about to unravel in the most spectacular way possible. The Marines entered with the confident swagger of warriors who had never met a challenge they couldn't overcome, their digital camouflage uniforms crisp despite the early hour. Staff Sergeant Mike Rodriguez led the group, his weathered face bearing the lines of 15 years in the Corps and 3 combat deployments that had taught him to assess threats and capabilities with surgical precision. Behind him, Corporal Jake Wilson, barely 22 and fresh from his 2nd deployment, surveyed the cluttered store with the barely concealed arrogance of youth, his eyes dismissing the small-town hardware shop as beneath the notice of elite Marines. Private First Class Emma Torres followed quietly, her observant nature already cataloging details that her male counterparts missed, while Sergeant David Park brought up the rear, his experienced gaze taking in everything with the measured caution of a veteran who had learned that assumptions could be fatal. The bell's chime seemed to echo through the store with unusual resonance that morning, though Sarah couldn't have known it was announcing the arrival of the moment that would shatter 8 years of carefully maintained obscurity. She looked up from her inventory sheets, her dark hair pulled back in a simple ponytail that framed a face most people forgot moments after meeting her. The Marines approached the counter with the easy confidence of men accustomed to having their presence acknowledged, but Sarah's greeting was the same understated professionalism she offered every customer who entered her domain. "Good morning, gentlemen. How can I help you today?" Her voice carried the soft cadence of someone who had learned to speak quietly in a world that rarely listened to what she had to say. Staff Sergeant Rodriguez stepped forward, his tactical boots clicking against the worn linoleum as he consulted a handwritten list that had seen better days. The paper bore the unmistakable signs of military planning, with neat columns and precise annotations that spoke to the methodical nature of Marine Corps logistics. "We need supplies for a training exercise up in the Blue Ridge area," Rodriguez explained, his tone carrying the automatic authority of a non-commissioned officer accustomed to having his requests fulfilled without question. "Rope, carabiners, emergency flares, and weather-resistant tarps. The exercise is scheduled for this weekend, and our usual suppliers are running behind schedule." Sarah nodded, already mentally cataloging the items in her store's inventory, but before she could respond, Corporal Wilson's voice cut through the morning air with the sharp edge of dismissive humor. "Think the hardware lady can handle military-grade specifications, Staff Sergeant?" Wilson asked, his tone suggesting the question was rhetorical and the answer obvious. His eyes swept over Sarah's modest appearance with the kind of casual dismissal that had become so familiar to her that it barely registered as an insult anymore. "I mean, we're talking about gear that needs to perform under extreme conditions, not fixing a leaky faucet in someone's kitchen." The other Marines shifted uncomfortably at Wilson's obvious rudeness, but none immediately challenged his assessment. Sarah's expression remained neutral, a skill she had perfected through years of enduring similar comments from customers who equated her quiet demeanor with incompetence. She had learned long ago that defending herself only invited more scrutiny, and scrutiny was something she could not afford. Instead, she simply moved to the storage area behind the counter, her movements efficient and purposeful as she began gathering the requested items. "I carry climbing rope rated for 2,000 pounds, she said quietly, returning with a coil of dynamic climbing rope that bore the certification marks of a premium manufacturer. The carabiners are aircraft-grade aluminum with a gate strength that exceeds military specifications. The emergency flares have a burn time of 45 minutes and are visible from 5 miles in clear conditions." Her knowledge of the technical specifications seemed to surprise Rodriguez, though he maintained his professional demeanor as she continued laying out equipment that clearly met or exceeded their requirements. Wilson, however, was not so easily impressed. "That's all well and good," he said with a smirk that suggested he was about to deliver what he considered a devastating observation. "But do you actually know how this stuff performs in the field? I mean, have you ever rappelled down a cliff face in 40-mile-per-hour winds? Or used flares to signal extraction under hostile fire?" The question hung in the air like a challenge, and Sarah felt the familiar weight of having to choose between revealing too much about herself and allowing others to maintain their comfortable assumptions about her limitations. Private Torres watched the exchange with growing discomfort, recognizing the unfairness of Wilson's attack on someone who was simply trying to help them. She had encountered enough competent women in non-traditional roles during her military service to know that expertise often came in unexpected packages, and something about Sarah's quiet confidence suggested depths that Wilson was too inexperienced to recognize. The hardware store itself seemed to reflect Sarah's understated competence, with every item precisely organized despite the apparent clutter that might confuse casual visitors. Hunting rifles were displayed behind locked glass cases, their scopes and accessories arranged with the attention to detail that suggested genuine knowledge of firearms. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Tactical equipment occupied a dedicated section near the back, featuring brands that serious outdoor enthusiasts and military personnel would recognize as top-tier manufacturers. Tommy Brennan, Sarah's 73-year-old assistant, emerged from the storeroom carrying a box of emergency signaling devices, his weathered hands steady despite his age. He had worked for Sarah's family for over 20 years, first with her father and now with her, and his loyalty was absolute. The old man's eyes flashed with protective anger as he caught the tail end of Wilson's condescending remarks, but Sarah's subtle shake of the head warned him against intervening. "Your gear will perform exactly as advertised," Sarah said quietly, beginning to tally the Marine's order on an old-fashioned paper receipt pad. "The rope has been tested in alpine conditions throughout the Pacific Northwest, and the flares have been used successfully in search and rescue operations by both civilian and military teams. If you have concerns about quality, I can provide manufacturer certifications and test data for every item." Rodriguez found himself impressed despite his initial skepticism about purchasing critical equipment from a small-town hardware store. The woman clearly knew her inventory and seemed genuinely knowledgeable about technical specifications, but Wilson's doubts echoed his own unspoken concerns about trusting their mission-critical gear to someone who had never faced the life or death situations where equipment failure could prove fatal. The morning light streaming through the store's front windows illuminated dust motes that danced in the air like tiny spirits, creating an almost ethereal atmosphere that seemed at odds with the tension building between the Marines and their unlikely supplier. Sarah continued her methodical preparation of their order, each movement precise and economical, betraying none of the thoughts racing through her mind as she calculated how much information she could safely reveal without triggering the kind of investigation that had forced her to abandon her previous life. Sergeant Park, who had remained silent throughout the exchange, stepped closer to examine a display of tactical knives that had caught his attention. The selection was impressive, featuring brands that were standard issue for special operations units, and the prices were surprisingly reasonable for equipment of such obvious quality. His experienced eye recognized several models that had served him well during deployments, and he began to wonder if there was more to this unassuming hardware store than met the eye. "You carry some serious gear here," Park observed, his tone more respectful than Wilson's had been. "This isn't the kind of inventory I'd expect to find in a small mountain town. Most hardware stores stock basic camping equipment and hunting supplies, not tactical equipment that would be at home in a military arms room." Sarah looked up from her calculations, meeting Park's gaze with the steady attention of someone who recognized a professional when she encountered one. Millbrook sits at the intersection of several major hiking trails and serves as a staging area for serious mountaineering expeditions, she explained, her voice gaining confidence as she discussed a subject where her expertise was unquestionable. "We get climbers heading for Mount Hood, search and rescue teams conducting training exercises, and outdoor enthusiasts who need equipment they can trust their lives to. Over the years, we've built relationships with manufacturers who supply military and law enforcement agencies." The explanation was plausible and largely true, though it omitted the more complicated reasons why Sarah had access to suppliers who normally dealt exclusively with government contracts. Her father had established many of those relationships during his own military service, but the connections she had cultivated since taking over the store ran through channels that would raise uncomfortable questions if examined too closely. Wilson remained unconvinced, his youthful arrogance preventing him from accepting that someone who looked like a small-town shopkeeper could possess genuine expertise in equipment he considered the exclusive domain of warriors like himself. "I still think we'd be better off waiting for our regular suppliers," he muttered to Torres, though his voice was loud enough for everyone in the store to hear. "At least then we'd know the gear was tested by people who actually use it in combat situations." The comment struck Sarah like a physical blow, not because it was particularly clever or cutting, but because it reflected an assumption that had haunted her for 8 years. The idea that her quiet life in Millbrook meant she lacked real-world experience was both completely understandable and utterly wrong, a paradox that she had constructed deliberately, but now found increasingly difficult to maintain. Torres felt compelled to intervene, her sense of fairness overriding any reluctance to challenge a fellow Marine in front of civilians. "Wilson, you're being unnecessarily rude," she said firmly, her tone carrying the authority of someone who had earned respect through competence rather than bluster. "This woman is trying to help us, and from what I can see, her inventory is excellent quality. Maybe you should focus on the mission instead of questioning the credentials of someone who's providing exactly what we requested." The rebuke clearly stung Wilson's pride, but before he could formulate a response, Rodriguez stepped forward to defuse the situation. He had seen enough interpersonal conflicts escalate into serious problems to recognize when intervention was necessary, and his primary concern was completing their equipment procurement without further complications. "We appreciate your help, ma'am," Rodriguez said to Sarah, his tone professional but warmer than it had been initially. "Your inventory appears to meet our specifications, and we're operating under a tight timeline. If you can have everything ready for pickup by 1400 hours, we'll take the complete order as listed." Sarah nodded, making a final notation on their receipt, before looking up with the same quiet professionalism she had maintained throughout the encounter. "Everything will be ready," she confirmed, tearing off their copy of the receipt and handing it to Rodriguez. "I'll have Tommy load the heavier items so they're ready for transport. If you have any issues with the equipment during your exercise, please let me know. Customer satisfaction is important to us, and I stand behind everything we sell." As the Marines prepared to leave, Wilson couldn't resist one final demonstration of his skepticism. "You know," he said with the smug confidence of someone delivering what he considered a devastating parting shot, if you're so confident in your gear, maybe you should come out to our training exercise and see how it performs in real conditions. Of course, I understand if you're not comfortable in that kind of environment. It can be pretty intense for civilians who aren't used to military operations. The suggestion was clearly intended as a challenge that Wilson expected Sarah to decline, confirming his assessment of her as someone who talked a good game, but lacked practical experience. He had no way of knowing that his casual invitation was about to set in motion a series of events that would shatter every assumption he had made about the quiet woman behind the hardware store counter. Sarah's response surprised everyone in the store, including herself. Actually, she said quietly, her voice carrying a note of something that might have been anticipation, "I'd be interested in observing your exercise. It would help me understand how our equipment performs under field conditions, and that information would be valuable for helping future customers. If you're serious about the invitation, I'd appreciate the opportunity." The Marines exchanged glances, Wilson's expression shifting from smug confidence to uncertainty as he realized his bluff had been called. Rodriguez found himself in the awkward position of either following through on his subordinate's invitation or appearing to back down from a challenge issued to a civilian, neither of which appealed to his sense of leadership responsibility. Torres smiled slightly, recognizing that Sarah had just accomplished something that seasoned Marines rarely managed by turning Wilson's arrogance back on itself without appearing confrontational or aggressive. There was something about the way the hardware store owner had accepted the challenge that suggested she was far more confident about her ability to handle whatever they might encounter than her modest appearance would suggest. The invitation that Wilson had intended as a dismissive gesture was rapidly transforming into something more significant, though none of them could have predicted just how significant it would prove to be. As the Marines filed out of Chun's hardware and supply, leaving Sarah alone with Tommy amid the familiar chaos of inventory and equipment, the morning mist outside seemed to be lifting, revealing the mountain peaks that surrounded Millbrook like silent sentinels. Sarah stood behind her counter, listening to the fading sound of military boots on the sidewalk outside, and felt the first stirrings of an emotion she had not experienced in 8 years. For the first time since she had buried Captain Sarah Chen of the United States Marine Corps and become simply Sarah Chen, small-town hardware store owner, circumstances were conspiring to force her back into the world she had abandoned. The carefully constructed life that had protected her secrets and allowed her to heal from wounds that went far deeper than the physical scars hidden beneath her modest clothing was about to be tested in ways she had hoped never to face again. Tommy watched her with the keen perception of someone who had known her family for decades, recognizing signs of internal struggle that would have been invisible to casual observers. "You don't have to prove anything to those young fools," he said, gently, his voice carrying the protective affection of a surrogate grandfather. "Let them think what they want to think. It's kept you safe this long." But even as the old man spoke the words they both knew he was right about, Sarah realized that 8 years of safety built on carefully maintained anonymity was about to end. Wilson's challenge had created a situation where backing down would raise more questions than participating, and questions were something she could not afford to have directed at her past. The training exercise that was supposed to demonstrate her equipment's reliability was about to become something far more significant, though none of them yet understood that the impossible shot Wilson had mockingly challenged her to make would soon become a matter of life and death for people she had never met. As the morning progressed and word spread through Millbrook about the Marines' visit to Chun's hardware, Sarah found herself facing the reality that her 8-year retreat from the world was coming to an end. The skills that had once made Captain Sarah Chen one of the most feared snipers in the Marine Corps were about to be tested again, not in the mountains of Afghanistan or the deserts of Iraq, but in the familiar forests of Oregon where she had hoped to live out her days in peaceful anonymity. The impossible shot that Wilson had jokingly challenged her to make was waiting somewhere in the mist-shrouded mountains above Millbrook, and despite every instinct that warned her to maintain her carefully constructed cover, Sarah Chen was beginning to remember what it felt like to be a warrior. The Elkerhorn Diner buzzed with the familiar rhythm of small town. Morning conversations as Sarah entered through the glass door that had been repaired more times than anyone could remember. The scent of bacon grease and fresh coffee hung in the air like an old friend's embrace, and the worn vinyl booths bore the marks of countless conversations that had shaped Millbrook's social fabric over the decades. She had come here seeking the normalcy of her Tuesday routine, hoping that ordering her usual breakfast would somehow restore the equilibrium that Wilson's challenge had disrupted just hours earlier. Marge Kowalski looked up from behind the counter, where she had ruled the Elkhorn's morning shift for 23 years, her graying hair pulled back in a style that had defied every fashion trend since the Reagan administration. The older woman's sharp blue eyes missed nothing in her domain, and she had watched Sarah Chen transform from the confident young woman who had returned to Millbrook 8 years ago into someone who seemed determined to fade into the background of small-town life. "Morning, honey," Marge called out with the easy familiarity of someone who had served Sarah the same breakfast every Tuesday for 8 years. "Your usual table's got some visitors this morning, though I suspect you already know about that." She gestured toward the corner booth where the 6 Marines from Chun's Hardware were engaged in animated conversation, their digital camouflage uniforms making them stand out like exotic birds among the flannel shirts and work clothes that dominated the diner's typical clientele. Sarah hesitated at the threshold between the entry area and the main dining room, acutely aware that every conversation in the diner had shifted to focus on the military visitors. Millbrook was accustomed to seeing Marines from Camp Cascade during their off-duty hours, but groups in uniform conducting what appeared to be official business were unusual enough to generate significant local interest. Corporal Wilson's voice carried clearly across the diner as he regaled his fellow Marines with an embellished account of their morning encounter at the hardware store. "So there we are, trying to procure mission-critical equipment for a complex mountain training exercise, and this little hardware lady starts lecturing us about technical specifications like she's some kind of expert." His tone dripped with the condescending amusement of someone who found civilian presumption both irritating and entertaining. Staff Sergeant Rodriguez looked up from his coffee as Wilson continued his narrative, noting the uncomfortable expressions on the faces of Torres and Park, the senior non-commissioned officer, had dealt with enough personality conflicts during his 15 years in the Corps to recognize when a subordinate's attitude was becoming problematic, but the informal setting of the civilian diner made immediate intervention awkward. "I mean, seriously," Wilson pressed on, oblivious to his audience's growing discomfort. "What could someone who spends her days selling screws and paint possibly know about equipment that needs to perform under combat conditions? She probably thinks tactical gear means buying camouflage-colored duct tape at the sporting goods store." His comment drew nervous laughter from a few local patrons who were eavesdropping on the Marines' conversation, though their amusement seemed forced and uncomfortable. Private Torres finally spoke up, her voice carrying the steady authority that had earned her respect throughout her unit, despite her relatively junior rank. "Wilson, you're being unnecessarily harsh about someone who is genuinely trying to help. U.S. From what I observed, her inventory was actually pretty impressive, and her knowledge of technical specifications seemed legitimate. Maybe you should focus on whether the equipment meets our needs instead of questioning the credentials of the person providing it." The rebuke landed with the weight of professional disapproval, and Wilson's expression shifted from amused superiority to defensive anger. Torres had touched on something that went beyond simple rudeness to a fellow Marine challenging his judgment in front of both military personnel and civilians. His response came loaded with the kind of masculine pride that had caused problems throughout military history. "Look, I'm not trying to be difficult," Wilson said, his tone suggesting exactly the opposite. But we're talking about gear that could mean the difference between mission success and failure. I've seen what happens when people rely on equipment that hasn't been properly tested. And I'm not interested in finding out that our rope fails when we're rappelling down a cliff face, because some small-town shopkeeper doesn't understand the difference between recreational climbing gear and military-grade equipment. Sergeant Park, who had remained silent throughout the exchange, finally decided to offer his perspective with the measured tone of someone who had learned to choose his battles carefully. "The equipment looked solid to me," he said quietly, his weathered hands wrapped around a coffee mug that bore the Elkhorn's faded logo. "I've used similar gear during training exercises and deployments, and the brands she carries are ones I recognize from military suppliers. Sometimes the best equipment comes from unexpected sources." His comment carried the weight of combat experience that even Wilson couldn't dismiss entirely, but the younger Marine's pride prevented him from backing down completely. "That may be true, Sergeant," Wilson replied with careful respect for Park's rank and experience. "But how do we verify that her specific inventory meets military standards? Just because she carries the right brands doesn't mean she understands how to select and maintain equipment for extreme conditions." The conversation had attracted the attention of several local patrons who found themselves caught between loyalty to a longtime community member and respect for the Marines who served their country. Walt Morrison, a retired logger who had known Sarah's father during his military service, shifted uncomfortably in his booth as he listened to the young Marine's disparaging comments about someone he considered family. Sarah remained near the diner's entrance, acutely aware that her presence would only escalate the situation, while her absence might be interpreted as validation of Wilson's criticisms. The delicate balance she had maintained for 8 years between remaining invisible and maintaining the respect necessary to operate her business was being tested in ways she had never anticipated. Marge Kowalski had heard enough of Wilson's commentary to form her own opinion about the young Marine's character, and her Chicago-bred directness finally overcame her usual policy of staying out of customer conflicts. "Excuse me, boys," she said, in a tone that immediately commanded attention throughout the diner, "but I couldn't help overhearing your conversation about Sarah Chen's competence. That young woman has been serving this community with integrity and expertise for 8 years, and I've never heard a single complaint about her knowledge or the quality of her merchandise." Wilson turned to face the older woman with the polite attention that military training had ingrained, though his expression suggested he viewed her intervention as misguided civilian sentimentality. "Ma'am, with all due respect, I'm sure she's a fine person and a good businesswoman, but that doesn't necessarily qualify her to provide equipment for military operations. We have very specific requirements that go beyond normal civilian applications." The response was tactful but dismissive, carrying the implicit message that civilians simply couldn't understand the complexities of military equipment needs. Marge's expression hardened as she recognized the condescension beneath Wilson's polite words, and her protective instincts towards Sarah overcame any inclination to avoid confrontation with customers. "Son," she said with the kind of maternal authority that had intimidated 3 generations of Millbrook residents, "I've been watching that girl since she came back to town, and I can tell you that she knows more about outdoor equipment than most people who've been in the business their whole lives. Her father trained her well before he passed, and she's built relationships with suppliers that most stores 3 times her size would envy." The mention of Sarah's father introduced a new element to the conversation that caught Rodriguez's attention. Military families often maintained connections and knowledge that transcended individual service records, and he began to wonder if there might be more to the hardware store owner's background than her modest demeanor suggested. "Was her father in the service?" Rodriguez asked, his tone shifting from casual interest to professional curiosity. Sometimes military families develop expertise that goes beyond typical civilian knowledge, especially in communities near active bases. Marge nodded, her expression softening as she remembered Sarah's father with obvious affection. Jin Chun served 2 tours in Vietnam and stayed in the reserves until he retired. She explained, her voice carrying the respect that small towns reserve for their military veterans. He opened the hardware store after his active duty ended, and he made sure Sarah learned everything about outdoor equipment and firearms before she took over the business. That girl could field strip a rifle and explain ballistic coefficients before she was old enough to drive. The revelation that Sarah came from a military family changed the dynamics of the conversation, though Wilson remained unconvinced that hereditary knowledge could substitute for personal experience. Family background might explain some technical knowledge, he conceded reluctantly, but understanding specifications and actually using equipment under stress are completely different things. Has she ever been in the military herself, or has she just been selling gear to other people who use it? The question hung in the air with particular weight because it touched on the central mystery that surrounded Sarah Chun's 8 years in Millbrook. Everyone in town knew that she had returned home after her father's death to take over the family business, but the details of what she had been doing before that homecoming remained deliberately vague. Most residents had accepted her obvious desire for privacy and never pressed for information she seemed reluctant to provide. Marge hesitated, recognizing that she was approaching territory where Sarah's carefully maintained boundaries demanded respect. I know she traveled quite a bit before coming back to Millbrook, she said carefully, but you'd have to ask her about the details. What I can tell you is that she's never steered anyone wrong when it comes to equipment recommendations. And she's helped outfit search and rescue teams, law enforcement agencies, and plenty of military personnel over the years. Torres listened to this exchange with growing interest, her instincts telling her that there was more to Sarah Chen's story than anyone was revealing. The way the hardware store owner had handled Wilson's rudeness suggested someone accustomed to dealing with challenging personalities, and her knowledge of technical specifications had seemed too detailed to come from purely academic study. Private First Class Martinez, who had remained quiet throughout the discussion, finally spoke up with a question that had been troubling him since their visit to the hardware store. Did anyone else notice how she organized her tactical equipment section? The way the gear was arranged and displayed suggested someone who understood how different items work together in field conditions. That's not the kind of knowledge you pick up from reading manufacturer catalogs. His observation sparked nods of agreement from Park and Torres, both of whom had noticed similar details that suggested practical knowledge beyond simple retail experience. Rodriguez found himself reconsidering his initial assessment of their equipment supplier, wondering if his team's casual dismissal of her expertise might be premature. Wilson, however, remained committed to his position that civilian knowledge, regardless of its apparent depth, could not substitute for military training and combat experience. "Look, I'm not trying to be unreasonable," he said with the tone of someone who considered himself eminently reasonable despite evidence to the contrary. "But we're responsible for our team's safety during this exercise. If something goes wrong, because we trusted equipment recommendations from someone who's never actually used this gear under combat conditions, we're the ones who'll have to answer for it." The statement revealed the heart of Wilson's resistance to accepting Sarah's expertise. His concern about equipment reliability was legitimate, but it was overshadowed by assumptions about civilian competence that prevented him from considering the possibility that someone outside the military might possess relevant knowledge and experience. At that moment, the diner's bell chimed as Colonel James Mitchell entered, his presence immediately commanding the attention of every Marine in the establishment. The base commander's appearance in civilian establishments was unusual enough to generate interest, but his decision to approach the Marines' table suggested that their morning activities had attracted official attention. "Good morning, Marines," Mitchell said with the easy authority of someone accustomed to command respect without demanding it. "I trust you're making progress on your equipment procurement for this weekend's exercise." Rodriguez and his team immediately stood at attention, their informal discussion abruptly shifting to military formality in the presence of a senior officer. "Yes, sir," Rodriguez replied crisply. "We've located a local supplier who appears to have everything we need. The equipment meets specifications, and the pricing is reasonable. We're scheduled to pick up our order this afternoon." Mitchell nodded approvingly, though his expression suggested there was more to his visit than casual interest in their logistics. "I understand you've been dealing with Chun's hardware," the colonel said, his tone carefully neutral. "Sarah Chen has quite a reputation in this community for expertise and reliability. I hope you found her service satisfactory." The comment carried subtle weight that suggested Mitchell's interest in their supplier went beyond routine command oversight. Wilson, emboldened by what he interpreted as an opportunity to voice his concerns to senior leadership, decided to share his reservations about their equipment source. "Sir, the hardware store does appear to have quality inventory, but I have some concerns about relying on civilian suppliers for mission-critical gear. Given the technical requirements of our exercise, I wonder if we might be better served by waiting for our regular military suppliers to fulfill our order." Mitchell's expression remained neutral, but Torres noticed a slight tightening around his eyes that suggested the colonel was less receptive to Wilson's concerns than the young Marine expected. "Those regular suppliers who are currently running behind schedule and can't meet our timeline requirements?" the colonel asked with mild curiosity that carried an undertone of reproach. Sometimes flexibility and adaptation are more valuable than rigid adherence to established procedures, Corporal. The gentle correction served as both a reminder about the mission's scheduling constraints and a subtle rebuke of Wilson's inflexibility regarding civilian expertise. Mitchell's response also suggested that the base commander had more knowledge about their equipment procurement than routine oversight would explain. "I'm confident that Sarah Chun's recommendations will serve your mission well," Mitchell continued, his tone carrying the finality of someone whose opinion should not be questioned further. "She has extensive knowledge of outdoor equipment and has provided excellent service to personnel from Camp Cascade for many years. I suggest you focus on your mission preparation rather than questioning the competence of someone who has proven herself repeatedly." The colonel's defense of Sarah surprised everyone at the table, particularly since it went well beyond what would be expected for routine supplier relations. His words carried the weight of personal knowledge rather than general community reputation, suggesting that Mitchell's acquaintance with the hardware store owner extended beyond casual business interactions. As Mitchell prepared to leave the diner, he paused to address one final comment to the Marines. "Your training exercise this weekend will present significant challenges that will test both your individual skills and your ability to work as a team under adverse conditions. I encourage you to approach those challenges with open minds and respect for expertise wherever you encounter it. Sometimes the most valuable lessons come from unexpected sources." The statement seemed directed primarily at Wilson, though its broader implications applied to the entire team's attitude toward their upcoming training. Mitchell's emphasis on open minds and unexpected sources of expertise suggested that the weekend exercise might involve more surprises than the Marines currently anticipated. After the colonel's departure, the Marines sat in contemplative silence as they processed the implications of their commander's unexpected intervention. Rodriguez found himself wondering what he might have missed about their equipment supplier, while Torres felt vindicated in her earlier defense of Sarah's competence. Wilson, meanwhile, struggled with the realization that his concerns had been not only dismissed, but actively contradicted by the base commander. The morning's events at the Elkhorn Diner had transformed what should have been a routine equipment procurement into something more complex and potentially significant. Sarah Chen, who remained a mysterious figure despite 8 years of community membership, had attracted the attention and apparent respect of senior military leadership in ways that transcended typical civilian-military business relationships. As the Marines prepared to leave the diner and return to their base for mission preparation, each carried different perceptions of their upcoming training exercise and the role that the enigmatic hardware store owner might play in its success or failure. The seeds of doubt that Wilson had planted about civilian expertise had been challenged by authority figures whose opinions carried considerable weight, but the underlying questions about Sarah Chen's background and qualifications remained unanswered. The morning mist that had shrouded Millbrook was beginning to lift, revealing the mountain peaks that surrounded the small community like silent guardians. Somewhere in those mountains, a training exercise was being planned that would test more than the Marines' tactical skills and equipment reliability. It would also challenge assumptions about competence, expertise, and the unexpected sources from which both could emerge. Part 3. The authorities hint Colonel Mitchell's office at Camp Cascade bore the austere functionality that characterized most military command centers, with gray metal furniture, regulation-issued American and Marine Corps flags and walls decorated with unit citations that represented decades of service excellence. The only personal touches were a handful of photographs showing the colonel with various military units in locations that suggested deployments to places where official photography was typically discouraged. He sat behind his standard-issue desk, reviewing personnel files with the methodical attention of someone whose decisions could significantly impact the lives and careers of the Marines under his command. The secure telephone on his desk buzzed with the distinctive tone that indicated a call from higher headquarters, and Mitchell answered with the crisp professionalism that had become second nature after 26 years of military service. Colonel Mitchell speaking. The voice on the other end belonged to Brigadier General Patricia Hayes, whose position at Marine Corps headquarters in Quantico gave her authority over training programs throughout the entire service. James, I wanted to follow up on the training exercise you've scheduled for this weekend, General Hayes said without preamble, her tone carrying the brisk efficiency of a senior officer dealing with multiple priorities simultaneously. I understand you've made some modifications to the standard curriculum that have attracted attention at higher levels. Mitchell leaned back in his chair, recognizing that his weekend training plan had generated interest beyond normal administrative oversight. Yes, ma'am. The exercise incorporates some unconventional elements designed to test adaptive thinking and challenge preconceived notions about operational effectiveness. I believe the Marines will benefit from exposure to scenarios that don't fit standard doctrinal approaches. His careful phrasing acknowledged the unusual nature of his training modifications without revealing specific details that might prove problematic if disclosed to unauthorized personnel. General Hayes was quiet for a moment, and Mitchell could almost hear her weighing the implications of his response. The official training schedule mentions civilian participation in observational roles, she said finally, her tone suggesting that this element had generated particular interest among her superiors. That's quite unusual for a military exercise, especially one involving tactical operations in remote terrain. The civilian involvement is limited and strictly observational, Mitchell assured her, though he knew that his explanation would raise more questions than it answered. The individual in question has extensive knowledge of the equipment being utilized and local terrain conditions. Her participation will provide valuable feedback on gear performance and environmental factors that could enhance future training effectiveness. Her participation, General Hayes repeated with emphasis that suggested Mitchell's choice of pronouns had not gone unnoticed. James, please tell me you're not involving some random civilian woman in a Marine Corps training exercise because of political pressure or community relations concerns. That kind of decision has the potential to create serious problems if something goes wrong. Mitchell found himself in the delicate position of defending a decision that he could not fully explain, without revealing classified information that existed far above General Hayes's clearance level. Ma'am, the civilian in question is uniquely qualified to provide the kind of specialized input that will make this exercise particularly valuable for the Marines involved. Her background includes relevant experience that exceeds what would normally be available from civilian sources. The explanation was technically accurate while remaining deliberately vague about the specific nature of Sarah Chen's qualifications for participating in military training operations. Mitchell had learned through carefully worded communications from intelligence channels that the former Captain Alexandra Morgan's presence in Millbrook was not coincidental, and that her enforced retirement from active duty had been designed to provide cover for ongoing operations that required her particular expertise. General Hayes's response carried the skeptical tone of a senior officer who had heard too many justifications for questionable decisions during her climb through the military hierarchy. "James, I've known you long enough to recognize when you're not telling me everything about a situation. If this civilian has the kind of background that would justify her involvement in military training, why isn't that information reflected in any official records that I can access?" The question struck at the heart of Mitchell's dilemma regarding Sarah Chen's participation in the weekend exercise. The official records of Captain Alexandra Morgan's service had been classified at levels that made them inaccessible to anyone without specific need-to-know authorization, and her transition to civilian life had been orchestrated to maintain that secrecy. Even general officers with significant responsibilities for Marine Corps training and operations were not automatically granted access to information about individuals whose service records touched on particularly sensitive operations. "Ma'am, there are aspects of this situation that involve security classifications beyond my authority to discuss over unsecured communications," Mitchell replied carefully, hoping that General Hayes would accept his oblique reference to classified materials. Without demanding specifics he could not provide, "I can assure you that the decision to include civilian observation was made with full consideration of operational security and training value." General Hayes was silent for nearly 30 seconds, and Mitchell recognized the pause as indicating serious consideration of his words and their implications. When she spoke again, her tone had shifted from skeptical questioning to the careful neutrality of an officer who suspected she was dealing with matters beyond her immediate purview. "Colonel, I'm going to trust your judgment on this matter, but I want you to understand that any unusual incidents or complications arising from civilian involvement in your training exercise will attract significant attention from headquarters. If there are background factors that justify this decision, I hope they also provide sufficient protection if things go wrong." The warning was both professional counsel and implicit acknowledgement that Mitchell's decision involved considerations that transcended normal training protocols. General Hayes had recognized the carefully coded language that indicated classified operations without explicitly acknowledging their existence, and her response reflected the delicate balance between oversight responsibility and respect for security compartmentalization. After ending his conversation with General Hayes, Mitchell retrieved a locked file cabinet key from the secure drawer in his desk and opened a compartment that contained materials requiring special handling procedures. The folder he extracted bore classification markings that restricted access to a very limited number of personnel, and its contents detailed operational records that officially did not exist. The documents inside painted a picture of Captain Alexandra Morgan that bore little resemblance to the quiet hardware store owner who had spent 8 years blending into Millbrook's small-town community. Her service record included deployments to locations that were identified only by map coordinates and operational designations that provided no geographical context. Mission reports described actions taken by someone whose capabilities exceeded those of typical Marine Corps personnel, including precision shooting achievements that bordered on the impossible. One particular document caught Mitchell's attention as he reviewed materials he had studied numerous times before. The after-action report from Operation Desert Mirage described a hostage rescue mission in an unnamed Middle Eastern location where Captain Morgan had neutralized 6 targets at ranges exceeding 800 meters while simultaneously directing a team of operators through complex urban terrain. The report noted that her shooting performance under extreme stress and adverse conditions had prevented a massacre of civilian hostages and allowed the successful extraction of high-value intelligence assets. Another file contained recommendations from the commanding officers who had worked with Captain Morgan during her active service years. The language was uniformly superlative, describing an officer whose tactical intelligence, marksmanship skills, and leadership capabilities placed her among the most effective special operations personnel in Marine Corps' history. Several reports specifically mentioned her ability to achieve successful outcomes in situations where standard tactical approaches had failed or were deemed impossible. Mitchell closed the classified folder and returned it to the secure file cabinet, his mind already turning to the weekend training exercise that would bring Sarah Chen back into contact with active military personnel for the first time in 8 years. The exercise he had designed was intended to challenge his Marines in ways that would reveal their true capabilities under stress, but he suspected that their greatest test would involve recognizing and accepting expertise that came from unexpected sources. The colonel's telephone rang again, this time with the internal tone that indicated a call from somewhere within Camp Cascade. Master Sergeant Williams's voice carried the professional efficiency of a senior non-commissioned officer dealing with routine administrative matters, though his message suggested anything but routine concerns. "Sir, I've had several Marines from different units asking questions about the civilian who's supposed to observe this weekend's training exercise," Williams reported with the careful neutrality of someone who recognized potentially sensitive information when he encountered it. "Word has spread that Staff Sergeant Rodriguez's team is working with someone from town, and there's considerable curiosity about civilian involvement in tactical training." Mitchell had anticipated that news of Sarah Chen's participation would generate interest throughout the base, though he hoped to minimize speculation until after the exercise concluded. "What kind of questions are they asking, Master Sergeant?" The colonel's tone indicated his desire for specific information rather than general impressions about Marine curiosity. Mostly about her qualifications and why command would approve civilian observation of training that typically requires security clearances. Williams replied diplomatically. "Some of the more experienced Marines are wondering if there's more to this than standard community relations, especially given the tactical nature of the exercise. There's also been some discussion about the equipment procurement from her store, and whether that creates conflicts of interest." The concerns Williams described were legitimate from a military perspective, where mixing civilian involvement with sensitive training operations could create security vulnerabilities and ethical complications. Mitchell understood the need to address these concerns without revealing information that would compromise Sarah Chen's carefully maintained cover identity. "Master Sergeant, please pass word to the interested parties that civilian observation has been approved at appropriate levels and serves legitimate training purposes," Mitchell instructed, his tone carrying the authority of someone whose decisions should not be questioned by subordinates. "The individual involved has been vetted for this specific role, and any security concerns have been addressed through proper channels." The response was designed to end speculation without providing additional information that might fuel further curiosity about Sarah Chen's background. Mitchell hoped that the implicit message about higher authorization would discourage Marines from pursuing questions that could lead them into classified territory where their access was inappropriate. After ending his call with Master Sergeant Williams, Mitchell found himself contemplating the complex web of circumstances that had brought a legendary special operations officer back into contact with active military personnel. Sarah Chen's 8-year retreat from the world of covert operations had been designed to provide both physical and psychological recovery from missions that had extracted a significant personal cost, but it had also maintained her availability for situations where her unique capabilities might prove essential. The weekend training exercise that had begun as a standard tactical evaluation for Rodriguez's team was evolving into something more significant, though Mitchell suspected that. Even he did not fully understand the forces that were bringing various elements together in the mountains above Millbrook. His instructions from higher headquarters had been carefully worded to suggest objectives beyond simple training, and his access to Sarah Chen's classified background indicated that her involvement was not coincidental. As the colonel prepared for his afternoon meetings with unit commanders and training coordinators, he reflected on the challenges that faced military leaders who operated in the gray areas between official policy and operational necessity. The weekend exercise would test his Marines' abilities to adapt and excel under challenging conditions, but it would also evaluate their capacity to recognize and utilize expertise, regardless of its source or official credentials. The mountains surrounding Camp Cascade held secrets that extended beyond simple geographic features, and the training exercise scheduled to take place in those mountains would reveal truths about capability, assumptions, and the unexpected sources from which both could emerge. Colonel Mitchell's careful orchestration of events was designed to create opportunities for growth and discovery, though he suspected that the most significant revelations would surprise even him. The afternoon shadows were lengthening across the base as Mitchell completed his review of the classified materials that provided context for the weekend's activities. Somewhere in the town of Millbrook, Sarah Chen was preparing for a return to the world she had abandoned 8 years earlier, while the Marines who would participate in the exercise continued their preparations without fully understanding the significance of what they were about to experience. The stage was set for a confrontation between assumptions and reality, between perceived limitations and actual capabilities, and between the comfortable certainties of military doctrine and the uncomfortable truths about expertise that existed outside official channels. The weekend would test everyone involved in ways they could not yet imagine, and the results would challenge fundamental beliefs about competence, courage, and the sources from which both could be discovered. Part 4. The Unexpected Opportunity. The emergency call came through Camp Cascade's communication center at 1400 hours on Friday afternoon, just as Staff Sergeant Rodriguez was conducting final equipment checks for the weekend training exercise. The duty officer's voice crackled through the base-wide communication system with the measured urgency that indicated a developing situation requiring immediate military response, though the specific nature of the emergency remained unclear to most personnel who heard the initial broadcast. Master Sergeant Williams burst through the doors of the equipment preparation area where Rodriguez's team was organizing their gear for the next morning's deployment. His weathered face carried the grim expression of someone who had received information that would significantly complicate what should have been a routine training exercise, and his rapid pace suggested that time was becoming a critical factor in whatever situation was developing. Rodriguez, Williams called out, his voice cutting through the normal preparation chatter with unmistakable authority. "We've got a developing situation that's going to impact your training exercise. 3 civilians are missing in the Blue Ridge Wilderness area, and Search and Rescue has requested military assistance for the recovery operation. Your team is being tasked to support the civilian authorities as part of a joint operation that will commence at first light tomorrow." The announcement transformed the atmosphere in the equipment room from routine pre-exercise preparation to the focused intensity that characterized actual operational deployments. Rodriguez immediately shifted into mission planning mode, his mind automatically calculating the implications of conducting a real-world search and rescue operation with Marines who had been preparing for simulated tactical training. "What's the situation with the missing civilians, Master Sergeant?" Rodriguez asked, his tone reflecting the professional concern of a leader who understood that lives might depend on their team's effectiveness over the next 24 to 48 hours. His team members gathered around to hear Williams's briefing. their expressions shifting from training anticipation to operational seriousness. 3 experienced hikers failed to return from a backcountry expedition that was scheduled to conclude yesterday evening, Williams explained, consulting a folder that contained preliminary information about the developing crisis. They were attempting a technical climb on the north face of Mount Cascade, which is some of the most challenging terrain in the entire region. Weather conditions have deteriorated significantly since they began their ascent, with heavy fog, freezing rain, and wind. Gusts that are making aerial search operations extremely difficult. Private Torres felt her stomach tighten as she recognized the implications of the situation Williams was describing. Technical climbing in adverse weather conditions created multiple opportunities for accidents that could prove fatal without rapid intervention, and the terrain features of Mount Cascade's north face were notorious among experienced mountaineers for their unforgiving nature and limited rescue access points. The missing hikers are Dr. Michael Harrison, a geology professor from Oregon State University, his research assistant Jennifer Walsh, and an experienced climbing guide named Robert Kim. Williams continued, reading from the incident report that had been forwarded from the county sheriff's department. They're all experienced outdoors enthusiasts with significant backcountry experience, which suggests that whatever prevented their return is serious enough to challenge even competent individuals. Corporal Wilson's mind immediately jumped to tactical considerations as he processed the information about their new mission parameters. Sir, if we're transitioning from training to actual search and rescue operations, do we need to modify our equipment loadout? Search and rescue requires different gear configurations than tactical training, and we might not have everything we need for effective civilian recovery operations. The question demonstrated Wilson's growing maturity as a Marine leader, showing that he was learning to think beyond immediate tactical concerns, to consider logistical and mission-specific requirements. Williams nodded approvingly at the young Marine's attention to operational details, recognizing that such thinking would be essential for mission success. That's exactly the kind of adaptive thinking this situation demands, Williams replied with obvious satisfaction at Wilson's question. Your training exercise has been modified to incorporate the search and rescue mission as a primary objective, with your original tactical scenarios serving as secondary training opportunities if time and circumstances permit. You'll be working directly with civilian search and rescue teams, and your success will be measured by your ability to locate and extract the missing civilians safely. Rodriguez absorbed this information while mentally recalculating their mission requirements and timeline. Search and rescue operations in mountainous terrain demanded different skills and equipment than tactical combat training, and the weather conditions Williams had described would create additional challenges that required careful planning and execution. What's our coordination with civilian authorities, Master Sergeant? Rodriguez asked, recognizing that joint operations between military and civilian agencies often involved complex command and control issues that could impact mission effectiveness. Will we be operating under military command structure, or will civilian search and rescue maintain operational control? Williams's expression suggested that command arrangements for the joint operation were still being negotiated between various agencies, a situation that often created confusion and inefficiency. During time-critical emergency responses, Colonel Mitchell is currently coordinating with the county sheriff and the State Emergency Management Office to establish unified command procedures. He explained carefully, for planning purposes, assume that you'll maintain military command structure for your team while coordinating closely with civilian search and rescue leadership. The arrangement Williams described was typical of joint operations where different agencies maintained their internal command structures while attempting to coordinate activities toward common objectives. Such arrangements could work effectively when all parties understood their roles and limitations, but they also created opportunities for confusion and conflicting priorities that could compromise mission success. Sergeant Park raised his hand. to ask a question that had been troubling him since Williams mentioned the challenging terrain features where the civilians had disappeared. "Master Sergeant, what kind of specialized rescue equipment do we have available for technical operations on Mount Cascade's north face? If the missing hikers are injured or trapped in locations that require technical climbing access, we might need gear that goes beyond standard military equipment." The question highlighted one of the fundamental challenges facing military units tasked with civilian search and rescue operations in specialized environments. Military personnel received excellent training in various tactical skills, but technical rock climbing and rescue operations required specialized knowledge and equipment that most units did not possess as part of their standard capabilities. Williams hesitated before responding, and his expression suggested that Park had identified a potential problem with their mission assignment. "The base has some technical climbing equipment available through the outdoor recreation program," he said slowly, "but our inventory may not include everything necessary for complex rescue operations in the kind of terrain you're likely to encounter. We're currently coordinating with civilian agencies to supplement our capabilities with specialized gear and expertise." The admission that Camp Cascade lacked comprehensive technical rescue capabilities was not surprising, since most military bases were not equipped to handle the specialized requirements of civilian emergency operations in challenging natural environments. However, it raised questions about how effectively Rodriguez's team would be able to respond to situations that might require capabilities beyond their training and equipment. Torres spoke up with a suggestion that reflected her growing understanding of their operational challenges. "Master Sergeant, wouldn't it make sense to coordinate with local experts who have experience with technical rescue operations in this specific terrain? The civilian search and rescue teams probably have personnel who know Mount Cascade's north face better than anyone, and they might be able to provide both expertise and specialized equipment that we're lacking." Her recommendation demonstrated the kind of thinking that distinguished effective leaders from those who relied solely on official capabilities without considering available resources that existed outside military channels. Williams nodded with obvious approval at Torres's suggestion, recognizing that successful joint operations often depended on identifying and utilizing the best available expertise regardless of its organizational affiliation. "That's exactly the kind of adaptive approach this mission will require," Williams agreed enthusiastically. "Colonel Mitchell has specifically emphasized the importance of working effectively with civilian experts and utilizing all available resources to accomplish the mission. This exercise will test your ability to integrate with non-military personnel and adapt standard procedures to address unique operational requirements." Wilson found himself experiencing mixed emotions as he contemplated their modified mission. Parameters. The opportunity to participate in actual life-saving operations was professionally exciting and personally meaningful, but it also meant acknowledging that military training and equipment might not be sufficient for mission success without civilian assistance and expertise. "Master Sergeant," Wilson asked carefully, "will the civilian observation that was planned for our original training exercise continue as part of the search and rescue operation? If we're dealing with a real emergency situation, it might not be appropriate to have observers who could interfere with operational effectiveness." His question reflected legitimate concerns about maintaining focus during life-threatening situations, while also revealing his continued discomfort with civilian involvement in military operations. Williams's response carried subtle implications that suggested the weekend's events had been orchestrated to serve purposes beyond simple training or emergency response. "The civilian observer will definitely be participating in the operation," he said with emphasis that indicated the decision was not subject to discussion or modification. In fact, her expertise may prove particularly valuable given the technical nature of the terrain and the specialized requirements of the rescue mission. The phrasing of Williams's response puzzled Rodriguez, who wondered why a hardware store owner's expertise would be relevant to technical rescue operations in challenging mountain terrain. Dawn broke gray and cold over the Blue Ridge Mountains. As Sarah Chen loaded her pack with equipment that no hardware store owner should have possessed, her weathered hands moved with practiced efficiency as she checked night vision optics, range-finding equipment, and communications gear that bore no manufacturer markings or serial numbers that could be traced through conventional channels. The basement workshop beneath Chun's hardware contained resources that would have impressed special operations units, though its existence was known only to a select few individuals whose security clearances extended into realms that officially did not exist. Tommy Brennan watched from the workshop's entrance as Sarah prepared for what she had told him was a search and rescue operation with the Marines from Camp Cascade. The old man's eyes reflected decades of working with the Chun family, and he possessed the kind of institutional knowledge that came from maintaining absolute discretion about matters that required careful handling. He had worked for Sarah's father during the years when Jin Chun's reserve service involved activities that could not be discussed with family members, and he understood that some aspects of the Chun family's capabilities were not subjects for casual conversation. "You sure about this, Sarah?" Tommy asked quietly, his weathered voice carrying the protective concern of someone who had watched her struggle through 8 years of rebuilding her life, after experiences that had left scars both visible and hidden. "Those Marines seem like decent enough boys, but they don't know what they're asking when they invite you back into that world. Once you step across that line again, it gets harder to step back." Sarah paused in her equipment preparation to meet Tommy's worried gaze, recognizing the wisdom behind his concerns, while also understanding that circumstances had moved beyond her ability to control them through careful avoidance. "The missing hikers need help, and the weather conditions are deteriorating rapidly. Search and rescue operations in that terrain require capabilities that most teams don't possess, and people are going to die if someone doesn't intervene with the right skills and equipment." The justification was reasonable and largely true, though it omitted the more complex factors that had led to her involvement in an operation that would inevitably expose capabilities she had spent 8 years concealing. Colonel Mitchell's carefully worded invitation had made it clear that her participation was expected rather than optional, and the intelligence briefing she had received through encrypted channels suggested that the missing hikers might not be simple victims of bad weather and poor judgment. Tommy nodded slowly, accepting her explanation while maintaining the concerned expression of someone who understood that Sarah's return to operational activities would carry consequences that extended far beyond the immediate mission. "Just remember that you've built a good life here in Millbrook," he said gently, his voice carrying the affection of a surrogate grandfather who wanted nothing more than her continued safety and happiness. "Don't let them pull you back into situations that nearly destroyed you the first time." The warning reflected Tommy's knowledge of Sarah's condition when she had first returned to Millbrook 8 years earlier, carrying psychological wounds that had required careful healing and the kind of peace that could only be found through complete separation from the world of covert operations. Her recovery had been slow and sometimes difficult, marked by nightmares and periods of intense anxiety that gradually diminished as she built new routines and relationships that had nothing to do with violence or death. Sarah secured the last items in her pack and turned to face Tommy with an expression that combined determination with acceptance of circumstances beyond her control. "I know the risks, and I know what I'm walking away from if this goes wrong. But those hikers didn't choose to be in danger, and the Marines who are trying to help them don't have the experience or equipment to handle what they're going to encounter up there. Sometimes you don't get to choose when your past catches up with you." The philosophical observation carried the weight of someone who had learned through painful experience that attempts to completely escape one's history were often frustrated by circumstances that demanded the very skills and knowledge one sought to leave behind. Sarah's 8 years of peaceful anonymity had been purchased through careful avoidance of situations that might require her specialized capabilities. But the missing hikers represented a crisis where moral obligation outweighed personal preference for continued obscurity. As Sarah made final preparations to leave for her rendezvous with the Marine team, she reflected on the strange sequence of events that had brought her back into contact with active military operations. Wilson's casual challenge about observing their training exercise had seemed like nothing more than youthful arrogance, but it had created an opening that allowed Colonel Mitchell to involve her in an operation that served purposes beyond simple search and rescue. The intelligence briefing she had received indicated that the missing hikers might not be victims of accident or poor judgment, but rather individuals who had stumbled upon activities in the remote wilderness that were not supposed to be discovered by civilian observers. The terrain where they had disappeared contained sites that were used by various groups for purposes that ranged from illegal drug cultivation to domestic terrorist training, and their fate might depend on which group they had encountered and how that group had chosen to handle unwanted witnesses. Sarah's specialized knowledge of the region's geography and the various groups that operated in its remote areas made her uniquely qualified to assist with recovery operations that might involve hostile action rather than simple technical rescue. Her background in covert operations provided skills that could prove essential if the missing hikers were being held against their will rather than simply trapped by weather and terrain. The drive to Camp Cascade took 45 minutes through mountain roads that were slick with morning frost and scattered with fallen leaves that created treacherous driving conditions. Sarah's modified pickup truck handled the challenging terrain with ease, its enhanced suspension and all-terrain tires reflecting the practical needs of someone who regularly traveled to locations where standard civilian vehicles would prove inadequate. The base's main gate was manned by Marines who recognized her from previous visits related to equipment deliveries and community relations activities, though their formal security procedures required her to provide identification and state her business despite their familiarity. The young Marines manning the checkpoint treated her with polite professionalism while processing her credentials, unaware that the woman they were admitting to their secure facility possessed security clearances that exceeded their own by several levels. Staff Sergeant Rodriguez waited for her in the parking area outside the base's Tactical Operations Center, his expression reflecting the controlled tension of a leader who was managing a complex mission with multiple moving parts and uncertain parameters. His team members stood nearby, their equipment organized in neat piles that demonstrated their preparation for operations in challenging mountain terrain, though Sarah's experienced eye noted several deficiencies in their gear selection that could prove problematic in the conditions they were likely to encounter. "Ms. Chen," Rodriguez said as she approached, his tone carrying the professional courtesy that Marines extended to civilians who were supporting their operations. "Thank you for joining us on such short notice. Colonel Mitchell briefed us on your willingness to provide technical expertise for this search and rescue operation, and we appreciate any assistance you can offer in locating the missing hikers." The formal introduction established their relationship as a cooperative arrangement between military personnel and a civilian expert, though Sarah suspected that Rodriguez had been given only limited information about her actual qualifications for participating in what might prove to be a dangerous operation. His respectful but somewhat cautious demeanor suggested that he was still processing the unusual circumstances that had brought a hardware store owner into direct involvement with Marine Corps' tactical operations. Corporal Wilson stood slightly apart from the group, his expression reflecting continued skepticism about civilian involvement in military operations, despite his commander's obvious acceptance of the arrangement. His body language conveyed reluctant compliance with orders rather than enthusiastic cooperation, and Sarah recognized that his attitude could create complications if the mission developed in ways that required complete team unity. Private Torres, stepped forward with a question that reflected her practical approach to operational planning. "Ms. Chen, could you brief us on the specific terrain challenges we're likely to encounter in the search area? The weather reports indicate deteriorating conditions, and local knowledge of the mountain's characteristics could help us plan our approach more effectively." The request for technical briefing provided Sarah with an opportunity to demonstrate expertise without revealing the full extent of her capabilities or knowledge sources. Mount Cascade's north face presents several unique challenges that distinguish it from other climbing areas in the region. She began, her voice taking on the authoritative tone of someone discussing a subject where her competence was unquestionable. The rock formations are primarily volcanic in origin, which creates unstable surfaces that can collapse under load. Weather systems approaching from the northwest tend to create severe wind shear effects that make helicopter operations extremely dangerous, particularly in the early morning hours when thermal inversions are most likely to occur. Her technical explanation impressed Rodriguez and Park, both of whom recognized that her knowledge went well beyond what would be expected from casual familiarity with local geography. The specific details about rock composition and weather patterns suggested either extensive research or direct experience with the terrain they would be navigating, and her confident delivery indicated genuine expertise rather than hastily acquired theoretical knowledge. Wilson remained unconvinced that civilian knowledge, regardless of its apparent depth, could substitute for military training and tactical experience in challenging operational environments. "With respect, ma'am," he said carefully, understanding. "Terrain characteristics is important, but search and rescue operations require tactical decision-making under stress and the ability to adapt quickly when situations change unexpectedly. Have you participated in operations where civilian lives depended on split-second decisions made under adverse conditions?" The question was designed to highlight what Wilson considered the fundamental limitation of civilian expertise when applied to military-style operations, and his tone suggested that he expected her to acknowledge the boundaries of her experience. Sarah met his challenging gaze with the steady attention of someone who had faced far more intimidating interrogations from individuals whose authority to question her decisions had been backed by significantly more power than a young Marine corporal possessed. "I understand your concerns about operational effectiveness," she replied evenly, her voice carrying no defensive tone despite the obvious challenge in Wilson's question. "Military operations and civilian emergencies do require different approaches and decision-making processes, but the fundamental skills of navigation, communication, and risk assessment apply in both contexts. My experience may be different from yours, but it includes situations where lives depended on correct decisions made under extreme pressure." The response was carefully crafted to acknowledge Wilson's legitimate concerns, while asserting her own competence without providing specific details that would raise uncomfortable questions about the nature of her previous experience. Sarah's tone conveyed confident authority without arrogance, suggesting someone who was accustomed to having her capabilities questioned, but also accustomed to proving those capabilities through performance rather than credentials. Sergeant Park, whose experience had taught him to evaluate people based on their actions rather than their apparent backgrounds, decided to test Sarah's knowledge with a more specific technical question. "If we encounter injured hikers in locations that require technical rescue, what equipment and techniques would you recommend for safe extraction without causing additional harm?" Some of the terrain features on Mount Cascade's north face would challenge even experienced rescue teams. The question provided an opportunity for Sarah to demonstrate practical knowledge that would be immediately relevant to their mission success, and her response would help determine whether her participation would enhance or complicate their operational effectiveness. She considered her answer carefully, recognizing that too much detail might reveal training that would be difficult to explain, while too little specificity might confirm Wilson's doubts about her qualifications. Technical rescue in unstable terrain requires a combination of mechanical advantage systems and redundant safety measures that account for potential equipment failure. She began, her explanation taking on the methodical tone of someone who had actually rigged and executed complex rescue operations. The key is establishing multiple anchor points that distribute load across stable rock formations while maintaining the ability to adapt quickly if conditions change. Weather factors like wind and precipitation affect rope dynamics and equipment performance in ways that require constant monitoring and adjustment throughout the operation. Her technical explanation impressed all 4 Marines, including Wilson, who recognized that her knowledge extended well beyond theoretical understanding to include practical details that could only come from hands-on experience with complex rescue operations. The specific terminology she used and the systematic approach she described suggested training and experience that exceeded what would be available through civilian volunteer organizations or recreational climbing instruction. Rodriguez found himself reconsidering his initial assessment of Sarah Chen's potential contribution to their mission, recognizing that her expertise might prove more valuable than he had initially assumed. The operation they were undertaking would test their ability to adapt standard military procedures to address unique operational requirements, and civilian expertise that complemented their tactical training could enhance their chances of mission success. As the team completed final equipment checks and prepared to board the helicopters that would transport them to their insertion point in the Blue Ridge Wilderness, Sarah reflected on the ironic circumstances that had brought her back into direct involvement with military operations. 8 years of careful anonymity were about to end because of a search and rescue mission that might not be the straightforward civilian emergency it appeared to be. The mountains surrounding Camp Cascade contained secrets that extended beyond simple geographic features, and the missing hikers might have discovered something that required more than standard search and rescue procedures to resolve safely. Sarah's specialized knowledge and capabilities were about to be tested in ways that would challenge her ability to maintain the carefully constructed identity that had protected her for 8 years. The helicopters waited on the base's landing pad with rotors turning slowly in the cold mountain air, their crews conducting final pre-flight checks, while ground personnel secured equipment and verified communication systems. The morning mist was beginning to lift from the valley floor, revealing mountain peaks that disappeared into low-hanging clouds that would complicate air operations and reduce visibility throughout the search area. As Sarah climbed aboard the lead helicopter and strapped herself into a position that would allow her to observe the terrain during their approach flight, she felt the familiar calm of operational focus beginning to assert itself over 8 years of peaceful civilian routines. The transition from hardware store owner to operational asset was happening more smoothly than she had expected, though she suspected that the psychological distance between those two identities had never been as great as she had tried to convince herself. The mission briefing had indicated that they would have limited time to locate and extract the missing hikers before weather conditions deteriorated beyond the point where helicopter operations would be possible. Their success would depend on efficient coordination between military personnel and civilian expertise, and their ability to adapt quickly to whatever situations they encountered in the remote wilderness areas where 3 experienced hikers had vanished without trace. Part 7. Early competence signals. The helicopter flight over the Blue Ridge Wilderness revealed terrain that challenged even experienced aviators, with wind patterns that created sudden turbulence and visibility conditions that shifted without warning as fog banks moved through the mountain valleys. Sarah observed the landscape below with the analytical attention of someone who understood how geographic features could either facilitate or complicate tactical operations, her trained eye automatically identifying potential landing zones, natural obstacles, and terrain features that could provide concealment or defensive advantages. Staff Sergeant Rodriguez noticed Sarah's intense focus on the terrain below and the way she occasionally made notes in a waterproof field notebook that appeared far more sophisticated than the simple notepad that most civilians would carry on recreational outings. Her observations seemed systematic and purposeful, suggesting a methodology for terrain analysis that went beyond casual interest in the geographic features they were overflying. The lead pilot's voice crackled through their headsets with updates on weather conditions and visibility constraints that were affecting their ability to conduct visual searches of the areas where the missing hikers were most likely to be located. Wind speeds are gusting to 40 knots at ridge level, and we're encountering severe downdrafts that are making low-level flight extremely dangerous. We may need to modify our insertion point to account for conditions that weren't predicted in the morning weather briefing. Sarah leaned forward to study the pilot's navigation display, her eyes quickly interpreting the electronic representation of terrain features and weather patterns with the fluency of someone who had extensive experience with aviation operations in challenging environments. The wind patterns you're encountering are typical for this mountain system when storm fronts approach from the northwest, she said through her headset microphone, her voice carrying the confident authority of someone providing technical expertise rather than casual observation. If you approach the primary landing zone from the southeast quadrant instead of the direct route, you can use the natural wind shadow created by the ridgeline to reduce turbulence during your final approach. The terrain features create a wind pattern that's more predictable and less dangerous than the conditions you're currently experiencing. Her suggestion demonstrated knowledge of local micro-weather patterns that exceeded what would be expected from recreational familiarity with the area. The pilot, a veteran warrant officer with over 15 years of flying experience in challenging terrain, found himself impressed by the civilian's apparent understanding of mountain aviation factors. He had encountered few civilians who possessed sufficient knowledge of wind patterns and terrain effects to offer useful advice during operational flights, and her confidence in providing technical recommendations suggested experience that went beyond theoretical study. "Roger that, ma'am," the pilot responded, already beginning to adjust his approach route according to Sarah's suggestions. "Your recommendation makes sense based on what I'm seeing on the aircraft's weather radar. Approaching from the southeast should give us better wind conditions and improved visibility for the landing." He executed the course change with the professional efficiency of someone who recognized good advice regardless of its source. Corporal Wilson observed this exchange with growing puzzlement about Sarah Chen's apparent expertise in areas that seemed far removed from hardware store operations. Her knowledge of aviation factors and terrain analysis suggested training and experience that would typically be found only among individuals with military or emergency services backgrounds. Yet her official civilian status made such expertise difficult to explain through conventional channels. Private Torres was taking notes of her own as she observed Sarah's interaction with the flight crew and her analysis of the terrain below. The specific terminology that Sarah used and her systematic approach to problem-solving reflected training methodologies that Torres recognized from her own military education, though she could not identify the specific source or nature of Sarah's apparent background. The helicopter touched down in a clearing that provided adequate space for operations while offering natural protection from the worst wind effects that were making flight operations throughout the region increasingly dangerous. As the team unloaded their equipment and established security around the landing zone, Sarah conducted her own assessment of their tactical situation with the practiced efficiency of someone who had performed similar evaluations in far more dangerous environments. The insertion point was approximately 2 miles from the area where the missing hikers had last been seen, requiring overland movement through terrain that would test both their navigation skills and their ability to maintain operational effectiveness in deteriorating weather conditions. Sarah studied the topographic map that Rodriguez spread on a portable field table, her finger tracing potential routes with the confidence of someone who understood how to balance speed, security, and terrain challenges in operational planning. The most direct route to the search area follows this drainage system, she said, indicating a route that would minimize elevation changes while providing natural cover from observation by hostile forces that might be operating in the region. However, the terrain features that make this route tactically advantageous also create natural choke points, where our movement could be observed or interdicted by anyone who understands how to use the geography to their advantage. Her analysis impressed Sergeant Park, who recognized that Sarah's approach to route planning incorporated security considerations that went beyond simple search and rescue operations. Her awareness of potential threats and her systematic evaluation of terrain features suggested tactical training that would typically be found only among individuals with military or law enforcement backgrounds. Rodriguez found himself facing a decision about how much authority to grant Sarah's recommendations regarding their movement and search procedures. Her technical knowledge appeared solid, and her suggestions had already proven valuable during their helicopter approach. But integrating civilian input into military decision-making required careful balance between utilizing expertise and maintaining command responsibility. What alternative routes would you recommend if we encounter problems with the primary approach? Rodriguez asked, his question designed to test the depth of Sarah's knowledge while gathering information that could prove crucial for mission success. Military planning always required contingency options, and Sarah's response would help determine whether her expertise extended beyond single-point solutions to comprehensive operational thinking. Sarah studied the map for several moments before responding, her analysis clearly incorporating factors that included weather patterns, terrain difficulty, and potential security threats that might not be immediately obvious to individuals without specialized training. This secondary route follows the ridgeline and provides better observation of the target area, but it exposes us to wind effects that could create hypothermia risks if we're forced to move slowly or establish extended observation posts. She traced an alternative path that demonstrated understanding of how weather conditions, terrain features, and operational requirements interacted to create tactical advantages and disadvantages. The third option involves a longer approach through this valley system, which provides excellent concealment and protection from weather, but it requires additional time that we may not have if the missing hikers are injured and require immediate medical attention. Her systematic presentation of alternatives with clear explanations of advantages and disadvantages reflected the kind of tactical thinking that characterized professional military planning, and her analysis incorporated factors that suggested extensive experience with operations in similar terrain and weather conditions. Wilson found himself struggling to reconcile Sarah's obvious competence with his preconceived notions about civilian capabilities in military-style operations. Her knowledge clearly exceeded what would be expected from recreational outdoor activities or theoretical study, but acknowledging her expertise would require abandoning assumptions about civilian limitations that had shaped his understanding of military-civilian relationships throughout his career. As the team organized their equipment for movement toward the search area, Sarah made several quiet suggestions about gear configuration and movement techniques that demonstrated practical knowledge of operations in challenging mountain terrain. Her recommendations were delivered in a conversational tone that avoided any appearance of challenging military authority while providing information that could enhance their operational effectiveness. The radio communication equipment you're using will have reduced range and reliability in this terrain due to the radio frequency absorption characteristics of the rock formations, she mentioned to Torres, who was responsible for maintaining communication with their base station and coordination with other search elements. You might want to establish relay positions at these elevation points to maintain contact with headquarters and other rescue teams operating in adjacent search areas. Her suggestion demonstrated understanding of technical communication factors that most civilians would not possess, and her specific recommendations for relay positioning reflected knowledge of how terrain features affected radio propagation in mountainous environments. Torres recognized the value of Sarah's advice and began incorporating her recommendations into the team's communication plan. Sergeant Park observed Sarah's equipment preparation with the analytical attention of someone who understood that gear. Selection and organization often revealed an individual's true level of experience and competence. Her personal equipment was organized with military precision, and several items in her kit appeared to be of higher quality and more specialized nature than would typically be carried by civilian outdoor enthusiasts. The night vision device she secured in her pack bore markings that Park recognized as indicating military specification equipment, though the specific model appeared to be more advanced than standard issue gear that would normally be available to civilian purchasers. Her personal communication radio was clearly a professional-grade device designed for tactical operations rather than recreational use, and her medical kit contained supplies that suggested training in field medicine beyond basic first aid. Rodriguez noted that Sarah's movement techniques during their initial advance toward the search area demonstrated training and muscle memory that came from extensive experience with tactical operations in similar terrain. Her footwork was silent and efficient, her situational awareness was constant and systematic, and her positioning relative to other team members reflected understanding of small unit tactics that would typically be found only among individuals with military training. The weather conditions continued to deteriorate as they moved deeper into the search area, with visibility dropping to less than 50 meters and wind speeds increasing to levels that made normal conversation difficult without shouting. Sarah's prediction about weather pattern development proved accurate, and her recommendations about route selection and movement techniques helped the team maintain operational effectiveness despite increasingly challenging environmental conditions. As they approached the area where the missing hikers had last been seen, Sarah began displaying knowledge of the specific terrain features and local conditions that exceeded what would be available through general familiarity with the region. Her comments about rock formation stability, water source locations, and natural shelter sites suggested detailed knowledge that could only come from extensive previous experience in this particular geographic area. The first indication that their search might involve more than simple accident or weather-related emergency came when Sarah identified signs of recent human activity that the Marines had not noticed during their initial reconnaissance of the area. The broken vegetation patterns around this camping area don't match what you'd expect from normal recreational use, she observed quietly, her voice carrying the controlled tension of someone who recognized potential security threats. Her analysis of the physical evidence at the campsite demonstrated investigative skills that went well beyond civilian outdoor experience, and her systematic approach to documenting and interpreting the signs they discovered reflected training in intelligence gathering and threat assessment that characterized professional security operations. The team was beginning to understand that their hardware store expert possessed capabilities that had not been revealed during their initial interactions, and that their search and rescue mission might be evolving into something more complex and potentially dangerous than anyone had initially anticipated. Part 8. The Reality Check. The abandoned campsite told a story that became increasingly disturbing as Sarah analyzed the physical evidence with the systematic methodology of someone trained in forensic investigation techniques. The scattered equipment and disturbed vegetation patterns indicated that the missing hikers had encountered something that caused them to abandon their carefully organized camp with such haste that they left behind essential survival gear that experienced outdoors enthusiasts would never willingly abandon in deteriorating weather conditions. Staff Sergeant Rodriguez watched Sarah's examination of the campsite with growing concern as her expression shifted from professional interest to the controlled tension of someone who recognized signs that indicated serious danger. Her systematic documentation of evidence and her careful avoidance of disturbing Potential forensic indicators suggested investigative training that went far beyond civilian outdoor experience, and her growing tension indicated that whatever she was discovering warranted immediate attention from law enforcement rather than simple search and rescue operations. These disturbance patterns around the perimeter of the camp indicate that the hikers were surrounded by multiple individuals who approached from different directions simultaneously. Sarah explained quietly, her voice carrying the measured tone of someone briefing tactical personnel on threat assessments. The equipment abandonment pattern suggests they were forced to leave quickly under duress, rather than departing voluntarily due to weather concerns or navigational errors. Her analysis was delivered with the professional detachment of someone who had encountered similar situations before, though the implications of her assessment created significant complications for what had been planned as a standard search and rescue operation. If the missing hikers had been taken against their will rather than simply lost or injured, the mission parameters would need to be modified to address potential hostile action and the safety of both the victims and the rescue personnel. Corporal Wilson found himself forced to acknowledge that Sarah's expertise appeared to extend into areas that he had not anticipated when questioning her qualifications for participating in military operations. Her systematic approach to evidence analysis and her apparent familiarity with investigative procedures suggested training and experience that would typically be found only among law enforcement or military personnel with specialized backgrounds. Private Torres began photographing the evidence that Sarah identified while maintaining careful documentation of their discoveries for potential use by law enforcement agencies that might need to investigate what appeared to be criminal activity rather than accidental disappearance. The systematic nature of Torres's documentation reflected her understanding that their search and rescue mission was evolving into something that required different procedures and protocols. The radio communication that Rodriguez attempted with their base station encountered the technical difficulties that Sarah had predicted, with terrain features and weather conditions combining to create communication blackouts that isolated the team from headquarters guidance and coordination with other search elements. The communication problems meant that they would need to make tactical decisions independently while dealing with a situation that appeared to involve criminal activity rather than simple emergency response. Sergeant Park studied the physical evidence that Sarah had identified while considering the tactical implications of their changing mission parameters. If the missing hikers had been taken by hostile forces, their rescue would require different approaches and capabilities than STANDARD search and rescue operations, and the team's equipment and training might not be adequate for what could become a hostage recovery situation. Sarah's continuing analysis of the abandoned campsite revealed additional indicators that confirmed her assessment of hostile action while providing information about the individuals who had been responsible for the hikers' disappearance. The footprint patterns indicate at least 6 individuals wearing military-style boots and moving with tactical discipline, she reported, her voice carrying the controlled urgency of someone who understood that time was becoming a critical factor in victim survival. Her ability to interpret tracking signs and extract tactical intelligence from physical evidence demonstrated skills that were typically found only among individuals with specialized military or law enforcement training, and her confidence in providing threat assessments suggested extensive experience with hostile situations that went far beyond civilian outdoor activities. The weather conditions that had been complicating their search operations were also affecting the individuals who had taken the hikers, and Sarah's analysis of the available evidence suggested that the hostage takers were moving toward a specific destination rather than simply attempting to evade pursuit through random movement. Her interpretation of the tracking signs provided directional information that could help the team intercept the hostile group before they reached whatever objective they were seeking. Rodriguez faced a command decision that would determine whether his team continued with modified search and rescue procedures or transition to tactical operations that addressed the apparent criminal activity they had discovered. The evidence that Sarah had identified clearly indicated that the missing hikers were victims of hostile action rather than accident or poor judgment. But responding to criminal activity required different authorities and procedures than military personnel were normally authorized to employ. The communication blackout with their base station meant that Rodriguez could not request guidance from higher headquarters about how to handle the evolving situation and the deteriorating weather. Conditions were creating time pressure that demanded immediate action rather than extended deliberation about proper procedures and authorities. Sarah approached Rodriguez with information that would influence his tactical decision-making while revealing additional aspects of her background that had not been apparent during their initial interactions. The hostile group appears to be moving toward a location approximately 3 miles northeast of our current position, she reported, her analysis based on tracking signs and terrain features that indicated a planned destination rather than random movement. Her confidence in providing directional intelligence and tactical assessments reflected experience with similar situations, and her systematic approach to threat analysis suggested training that went beyond civilian capabilities. The specific location they're approaching contains natural defensive features that would be advantageous for establishing a defensive position or conducting other activities that require concealment from observation. The intelligence that Sarah provided included details about terrain features and tactical considerations that would be immediately relevant for planning any response to the hostile situation, and her presentation reflected the kind of operational thinking that characterized professional security operations rather than civilian emergency response. Wilson listened to Sarah's briefing with the growing realization that his assumptions about civilian limitations in tactical situations had been fundamentally incorrect, and that the woman he had dismissed as unqualified for military operations possessed expertise that exceeded his own in several critical areas. Her knowledge of tracking, threat assessment, and tactical intelligence clearly came from extensive training and experience that she had not revealed during their initial interactions. Torres recognized that Sarah's analysis of their tactical situation was providing information that could be crucial for mission success, while also raising questions about the nature of her background and the reasons for her involvement in what had originally been presented as a routine training exercise. The specialized knowledge that Sarah displayed suggested preparation for exactly this type of situation, which seemed unlikely to be coincidental. The team's equipment and training had been configured for search and rescue operations rather than tactical response to hostile action, and their transition to addressing criminal activity would require adapting their procedures and capabilities to handle situations that went beyond their original mission parameters. Sarah's expertise was becoming increasingly valuable as the operation evolved beyond standard search and rescue into something that required specialized knowledge and tactical thinking. Sergeant Park asked Sarah a direct question about her assessment of the tactical situation and her recommendations for responding to the evolving threat. Based on your analysis of the evidence and the hostile group's apparent destination, what approach would you recommend for intercepting them before they reach their objective? His question acknowledged her expertise while seeking specific tactical advice that could guide their response to the situation. Sarah's response demonstrated tactical thinking that incorporated multiple factors, including terrain advantages, weather effects, and the need to ensure victim safety while neutralizing the threat posed by the hostile group. The terrain features along their route of movement create several opportunities for interception, but any tactical response needs to account for the safety of the hostages and the possibility that the hostile group has additional personnel or resources that we haven't identified. Her systematic presentation of tactical options and risk factors reflected professional-level operational planning capabilities, and her emphasis on hostage safety indicated experience with situations where Tactical success required careful balance between aggressive action and victim protection. The team was beginning to understand that their mission had evolved far beyond standard search and rescue operations into something that required capabilities and expertise that they had not expected to need. The deteriorating weather conditions were creating additional urgency for their tactical decision-making, as visibility and mobility would continue to decrease until conditions became impossible for effective operations. Sarah's weather predictions had proven accurate throughout their mission, and her current assessment indicated that they had limited time to intercept the hostile group before environmental conditions would prevent any effective response. Rodriguez made the command decision to pursue the hostile group based on Sarah's intelligence and tactical assessment, recognizing that the safety of the missing hikers depended on immediate action rather than waiting for additional resources or higher headquarters guidance that might not be available due to communication difficulties and weather constraints. As the team prepared to transition from search and rescue operations to tactical pursuit of armed hostiles, each member recognized that their mission had become something far more serious and dangerous than anyone had anticipated. Sarah's expertise was proving essential for their ability to respond effectively to the evolving situation, though her knowledge and capabilities raised questions about her background that would need to be addressed once the immediate crisis was resolved. Part 9. The Choice Point. The moment of decision arrived as Rodriguez studied the tactical situation through binoculars that revealed the hostile group moving through a narrow valley approximately 800 meters from their observation position. Through the swirling mountain mist, he could clearly see 6 armed individuals escorting 3 bound captives along a route that would bring them to a defensible position within 30 minutes if their current pace continued unchanged. Sarah crouched beside Rodriguez, her own observation equipment focused on details that would be crucial for any tactical intervention they might attempt. The hostage takers were moving with military precision, maintaining proper spacing and security. Protocols that indicated professional training rather than amateur criminal activity. Their weapons appeared to be military-grade assault rifles, and their movement techniques suggested combat experience that would make any rescue attempt extremely dangerous for both the rescue team and the captives. "We need to make a decision," now Rodriguez said quietly, his voice reflecting the weight of command responsibility in a situation that had escalated far beyond his original mission parameters. "If we're going to intercept them before they reach that defensive position, we have maybe 20 minutes to get into position and execute whatever plan we develop. After that, any rescue attempt becomes exponentially more difficult and dangerous." The staff sergeant's tactical assessment was accurate based on the terrain features and the hostile group's rate of movement, but it also highlighted the fundamental challenge facing his team. They were equipped and trained for search and rescue operations rather than tactical combat against armed opponents, and their success would depend on achieving surprise and overwhelming tactical advantage despite being outnumbered and outgunned. Sarah's analysis of the tactical situation incorporated factors that the Marines had not immediately considered, but which could prove crucial for mission success. "The wind patterns in that valley create acoustic effects that will mask our approach. If we move from the eastern slope," she explained, her voice carrying the confident authority of someone who had planned and executed similar operations. "However, the same terrain features that provide concealment also limit our escape routes if the tactical situation develops unfavorably." Her systematic evaluation of advantages and disadvantages reflected the kind of operational planning that characterized professional military operations, and her specific knowledge of how environmental factors would affect tactical effectiveness suggested extensive experience with combat operations in similar terrain and weather conditions. Corporal Wilson found himself facing a fundamental reassessment of his assumptions about civilian capabilities and military-civilian cooperation in dangerous situations. Sarah's tactical knowledge clearly exceeded his own in several critical areas, and her confidence in providing operational recommendations suggested background and experience that she had not revealed during their initial interactions. The question that every team member was considering, though none had explicitly voiced, involved the moral and legal implications of conducting what amounted to a military assault against American citizens on domestic soil. Their mission had evolved from search and rescue to hostage recovery, but their authorities and legal protections remained unclear in a situation that fell into gray areas between law enforcement and military operations. Torres raised the question that was troubling all of them about the legal framework for their proposed actions. "Sergeant, if we engage these individuals in combat to rescue the hostages, what's our legal standing? We're military personnel operating on domestic soil against civilian targets, which puts us in violation of posse comitatus unless we have specific authorization that I haven't heard about." Her concern reflected legitimate questions about the legal authorities that governed military action in domestic situations, and the potential consequences that could result from exceeding their authorized scope of operations. Military personnel who engaged in unauthorized law enforcement activities could face serious criminal charges, regardless of their motivations or the outcomes of their actions. Rodriguez recognized the validity of Torres's concerns while also understanding that legal considerations might be secondary to the immediate need to save innocent lives from individuals who appeared willing to use violence against civilians. The legal framework for their situation was complex and unclear, but the moral imperative to prevent harm to innocent victims seemed to outweigh procedural concerns about proper authorities. Sarah addressed the legal question with information that suggested she possessed knowledge of authorities and procedures that went beyond civilian understanding of military legal relationships. Emergency response to imminent threat of harm to civilian lives provides legal justification for military intervention under specific circumstances, she explained carefully, her tone indicating familiarity with legal precedents and emergency authorities that were not common knowledge. Her response suggested access to legal briefings and operational authorities that would typically be available only to individuals with specialized military or law enforcement backgrounds, and her confidence in addressing complex legal questions indicated experience with situations where such authorities had been invoked. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.